Hey there, I'm Joey from EDA Trek. Let's talk about something awkward. Has this ever happened to you? Someone tells you about their silly theme deck, like this is a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles deck, or this is a Game of Thrones deck, or an Oops All Elks deck, or something like that. But then, when you look through their list, or when you're in a game with them, you see that they're playing a whole bunch of the classic Commander go-to powerhouses. Cyclonic Rifts, Torment of Hailfires, the works. What are your emotions in that moment? Are you skeptical? Do you feel like your joy has been punctured in any way because those things aren't quite fitting to the theme that was promised? More importantly, have you been this person? Have you been the person who's trying to make a silly theme deck, but then you feel like you need to use some of those staples just to make sure that the deck can do anything in a game? That's the conundrum that I'd like to explore today, but we'll have to do it from a couple of different angles, because it's a pretty interesting and fairly complicated issue, one that I've seen pop up a bit over the years in many various forms. Like sometimes it's really mild, but then there are some moments where it can be a bit egregious, I guess is the word. Like I think I've joked about this before, but I've absolutely seen someone who went, oh, this is my all unicorns theme deck, and then they tooth and nailed into an Avenger of Zendikar and Craterhoof combo to win the game on the spot, and it was like, am I missing something here? Are those honorary unicorns? What's going on, sweetie? Now, I think it's safe to say that's a pretty extreme example, and very plainly the primary issue is with the person who's willfully misrepresenting their intentions to get an easy win. That's super annoying, but that's not the actually interesting thing to investigate here, right? That's too broad of a brush for us to paint with today. Instead, I want to take a closer look at the phenomenon of people putting, quote, good stuff EDH staples into decks that they say they want to adhere to a very restrictive theme. Why does that happen? Why are people motivated to take that action in those strict scenarios? And more than that, I want to explore our reactions when we see it happen. How do we feel as opponents when a person plays a card that, to our eye, strains the theme that they said they were going for? The reality of the situation is, as usual, quite complicated. And over the past year, as I've been leaning more into building some silly theme restrictive decks of my own, it's something that I realize I keep on having to remind myself of, and that I keep catching myself on. So, what's going on here? First, let's paint a proper picture with an example. Say someone's interested in an Oops All Crabs deck. They saw Charix and loved it and want to play a bunch of silly crabs, a creature type that has next to no support cards and a low density of total creatures to choose from. But it's a silly theme, and that's what EDH is all about, so they go for it. But very obviously, this kind of deck will not pack much actual punch just on that concept alone. To be honest, I think this is the stage where a lot of deck ideas die, right? You have an idea for a deck, but it doesn't have a lot of support to flesh it out properly, so you just let it drop, and maybe you'll return to it if it happens to get more toys in the future. When a deck is just a meme, but it would get just smooshed, raffle stomped, just absolutely bombed at a regular old game night, it can start to feel like, yeah, maybe this is actually more fun as a concept than it would be in execution. You can't rely upon everyone else to also be playing silly meme decks. They're probably also going to play some of the more typical fare out there, and just speaking practically, if you go to a sword fight but all that you're armed with are a couple of punchlines, you're not actually going to get to play much Magic. It's not like you need the deck to win to enjoy it, but no one likes the experience of doing flat out nothing in games. And apparently this is a point that I have to clarify, because genuinely people will go, oh yeah, I thought casual players don't care about winning, thinking that they've like got you in a checkmate or something, and it's like, you are really missing the point here, you know? There's a difference between wanting to win and not wanting to insta-lose. There's a difference between wanting to win and just wanting to be able to actually get to play some Magic. Like, dang, you really think you ate with this comment too, but it's pretty straightforward. Commander players just like being able to play Commander. The point is, a strict theme deck sometimes risks not being able to contribute to a game, and not contributing to a game has its own sorts of feel-bads. And not just on your own enjoyment either. When you're in a game and one person's become the archenemy and the whole table needs to work together to keep them from winning next turn, but all that you do on your turn is play a 2/5 crab, that doesn't feel great. In short, some theme decks that commit mega hard to a theme may get so thoroughly thrashed that you and the people you game with don't necessarily get the enjoyment of that silly theme in the first place. This is why so many of the Universes Beyond sets have in-universe versions of those big popular go-to spells, you know? If you're going to play an all Doctor Who deck or an all Lord of the Rings deck, you want the deck to have some actual staying power, rather than feeling that if you want the deck to even stand a remotely fighting chance, you'd have to compromise by including non-themed cards. So back to that strict theme example, when you're brewing and you know that theme that you're going for is pretty thin on the ground, but you do still need to have some edge to make sure the deck doesn't keel over immediately, what do? Well, some players just accept it and don't mind a mediocre deck even if it is indeed the meatiest of ochres. But some others start to search for a little more oomph, a little more firepower that will keep you around long enough to actually realize that theme during a game. And that's when and why some folks turn to the classics, cards that many have labeled as good stuff. Now, lots of folks probably already know that term, but in case you don't, good stuff is a term often used derogatorily in the Magic space to describe simply generically good cards that are powerful in basically every deck. Dockside Extortionist isn't a dragon, but it's not like it would be a bad card in your Ur-Dragon deck, you know? And a good stuff deck would be a deck that is chock full of these individual powerhouse cards. Generally, it's a label that players tend to assign to cards disparagingly because, to be a little blunt about it, they're most often just kind of sick of those cards. And when you're using those classic spells or those quote good stuff cards to pad out a theme deck that doesn't otherwise have a ton of support, that's when it can start to get thorny, right? Because there are some justifications that really can make some of those big cards flavorfully fit into a theme deck. In your hypothetical Avatar: The Last Airbender theme deck, you could theoretically justify Path to Exile to represent Zuko's exile in the story, or what have you. But the more of those classic cards that you try to play, the more that you'll have to stretch to justify or rationalize them, and the more that you end up straining the thematic immersion that the deck was after in the first place. And even if the card reference makes a lot of sense to you, the brewer, like this Rhystic Study represents all the studying that the character Katara did in the show, or whatever, sometimes opponents might be a little bit like, when you cast that card in a game. Or when you cast, a Cyclonic Rift in a game. Like, yeah, technically that could fit into an Avatar deck. That is an elemental looking thing that the Avatar character could do, but the immediate impression of that spell is still, Cyclonic Rift. It could cause opponents to raise a somewhat skeptical eyebrow. Like, did you really want to build a theme deck, or were you just looking for an excuse to play some powerhouse spells? I imagine that's why some folks don't even bother trying to apply their chosen theme to 100% of the cards in their theme decks. Like, there aren't that many crab-related spells, right? So then just focus the theme on the creature side of things, and then the spells can be whatever the deck needs. And in general, that's a perfectly fine strategy. But also, sometimes the support spells that people choose to use to give their decks some extra punch might take the form of, say, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Will, Mana Drain, and 8 other counter spells, or a bunch of lock pieces. The theme is still technically intact, that is a Crabs deck, but the experience of playing against it doesn't feel like the silly thing you might expect from the words, "Oops, all crabs." It follows the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law. Or here's another way that this might manifest. The fact that some cards, like Horseshoe Crab, are used in infinite combos means that maybe they might build the deck to combo out with that crab. That's their way of giving the deck the firepower that it may otherwise lack. And frankly, they might even be doing it that way to avoid an alternative such as playing a bunch of powerful counterspells. I'd certainly prefer a quicker end than a hard control deck pecking me to death with a bunch of 2/5s and 1/3s. But as their opponent, it still feels kind of weird, right? As the opponent, we're more inclined to say, that's a combo deck, rather than saying, that's a crab theme deck. We as the opponent are seeing kind of a zoomed out end result of the deck, rather than seeing where the deck started and how it got to where it is now. But these are the ways that players find themselves in this type of conundrum. To make the deck stand literally any chance of being able to stand in the same ring as the classic Muldrothas and Atraxas that populate the Commander landscape, a theme deck might end up playing a lot of those cards that people label as good stuff. I'm realizing that I've used this crab theme deck example pretty heavily here, and I just want to be clear that I'm not trying to single anyone out with it. I'm not even talking about people who play Charix in general. Like, we all understand that, right? Or at least we should, but I know how the internet works. People are going to be weird about it no matter what commander I choose as an example. This one just happened to work really well as an example for the ways that the search for an unusual theme can sometimes morph into something that was not anticipated from the start. And also real quick, if you want to see an example of someone who navigated the crab theme deck idea super well, check out Voxy's Charix deck on Shuffle Up and Play. It's brilliant. Also, I want to be extra clear that this video isn't about judging the people who go through with brewing those theme decks in any of those accidentally good stuff ways either. Because here's the thing, even if you find a silly theme to build a deck around, and that theme does have enough support that you don't have to strain the theme with any of those good stuff cards, you can still run into the situation where it still starts to feel like you are just playing those generically powerful good stuff cards, or that you're creating play experiences that other people don't like, despite your commitment to that janky theme. Case in point, Me. Many of y'all know my Commander deck. I've made a whole video about it before. In this deck, every card must refer to the commander. It's one of my most played decks. I love playing it, people love playing against it. And I apply this deck's theme restriction not just to my spells and creatures, but also to my land base. So outside of basic lands, I only get to use non-basic lands that also refer to a commander. This is a hugely limiting factor on how good the deck can be. It's a 4-color deck running 35 basic lands, and the only ramp or color fixing spells in the entire deck are Commander Sphere and Arcane Signet. When I built this deck, I mostly just wanted to have a bunch of backgrounds that gave double benefits to 2 commanders. And frankly, I play a couple of partner decks, and backgrounds are just always so amazing in those decks too. Give backgrounds a shot in partner decks if you haven't done so yet. But here's the thing about this deck. I didn't expect it to be good, I guess? Every card relies upon the commanders being in play. If you kill the commanders, the entire thing crumples like a house of cards. And a ton of these card choices are also not great, capital N, capital G. But it turns out, this deck is good. Honestly, it kinda slaps. As many of y'all know, I tracked all my games last year, and we're releasing a full episode about the results very, very soon, which I'm not going to spoil here, but as a quick teaser, this deck's win percentage and how quickly it could end a game were a big surprise to me. I expected it to just be a fun theme deck that didn't win a lot, but suffice it to say, it won plenty of games. So we run into it again. Even with a silly theme, Tana and Tymna are still Tana and Tymna. Even with the restriction, I'm still playing Deflecting Swat, Deadly Rollick, Jeska's and Akroma's Will. In fact, this deck's theme would even justify a Jeweled Lotus if I owned one. In crafting a theme deck, I'm still playing cards that many would qualify as good stuff. Heck, this is kind of the whole Volo problem, right? When Volo came out, a bunch of folks started buzzing about how finally, at last, a Simic commander that didn't just incentivize you to play all of the generically good cards. And then people built it and found out, no, actually it does exactly that. It's got a restriction that diverts the deck right back into classic powerhouse territory. Or, let's be honest here, how many times have you gone to build a deck with a fun-looking theme, only to find out that the deck, just by sheer accident, oopses into combo territory that you weren't originally looking for? Like Morph decks, which run all of the pieces of the infamous Pickles lock to keep opponents from ever untapping. These are each individually just solid pieces for a Morph deck, so of course Morph decks run them. But together, maybe they produce a game state that you weren't expecting when you first built the deck. Or Calamax decks, which love to copy things. And yet, literally any copy spell that you add to the deck immediately turns into an infinite loop of the spell copying itself and copying itself and copying itself, and then you have an infinitely huge commander. I just wanted to copy things, but running even one copy spell suddenly makes the deck feel very different than I thought. Uh-oh. There's no problem with using any of these. My brother has a Morph deck with all of the cards I just mentioned, and it's a blast to play against. The point is just that there are lots of cases where going in the natural direction to upgrade the deck might make you oops into a totally different thing than what may have originally drawn you to that deck in the first place. So what do we do about all this then? Because sometimes it just happens to people on accident, like with the Calamax example. That one catches a lot of people off guard. But other times it happens on purpose, but not in a way that's necessarily deceitful. A person lying about their unicorn deck is a very different thing than a person who's just trying to get their dang crab deck to work. I think plenty of folks will say the solution here is to only ever play those meme-themed decks against other similar janky-themed decks, rather than compromising the integrity of your theme deck by besmirching it with those good stuff cards in the 99. Just don't play it against any of those decks that you know you don't stand a chance against anyway, and then you won't feel the pressure to play any of those Cyclonic Rifty type of cards. That sounds like a solution, but I don't think it's a practical one. For one thing, not everyone out there builds dirtily meme decks. So if you adopt that as a rule, you might have no one to play it against. Don't run a silly jank theme deck into other people's high-powered stuff, certainly. But if you are holding out for the platonic ideal of a meme dirtle jank pod, you might be holding your breath for a very, very long time. I definitely understand that the pressure here comes from the fact that other people are playing something that is more powerful. And so if you don't do that, then you won't feel that pressure to play more good stuffy cards in your own deck. Yes, that totally makes sense. But also, presumably, you built the deck because you want to share that experience with other people. And that means, actually getting to play it. So the solution that we look for should hopefully be one that encourages people to play it, rather than encouraging people to not play it. The real irony here is that the theme itself is kind of the culprit. By holding so tightly to a strict theme that is off the wall and doesn't have a whole lot of support, that strategy ends up being kind of motionless in the water. So to get the deck to tick at all requires a comically huge boost, which leads to the inclusion of those other powerhouse cards, because those cards can jolt anything to life. By contrast, strategies and themes that have more support feel less of that need to play any of those big classics, because the deck can chug along just fine without them. I don't feel a pull to play Torment of Hailfire and Cyclonic Rift in my zombies deck, you know? I've got a zillion other zombie cards that I could mess around with in those card slots. That irony is even sharper for players who build an entire deck around a very specific off-the-wall card in the 99, because often to ever find that card and get it into play in the first place, the number of tutors that they'll use in that deck goes up and up and up to try and get that thing out onto the battlefield. And then, once you have it on the battlefield, well, your deck is still full of a whole bunch of other tutors, and those tutors will absolutely shape the way that you play the rest of that game. That's the weird paradox. Restrictive, janky theme decks feel the greatest amount of pressure to play those good stuff cards. So again, what do we do about it? Well, there are different gradients to this issue, and I think one of the best ways to figure out how we feel about it is to pay attention to our reactions as the opponents of these types of decks. For instance, I mentioned that in my Commander deck, I apply the restriction even to my non-basic lands. I could easily have built that deck only applying that restriction to the non-land cards. That way I could play actual color fixers and make sure that the deck actually gets to play consistently, instead of me struggling to get all 4 of my colors each game. And in fact, when I play it, I usually find that people are surprised that I'm not doing that with my land base. They're shocked that I am going so far with the theme. I think I'd probably earn some occasional side eye if I played like a souped up fetch land Triomes all super powerful lands mana base in that deck, but I don't think I would encounter people who have an outright problem with it, since the main meal of that deck would, in that case, still follow the theme, and getting basic support for the deck to function doesn't seem like the biggest deal. Compare that to the reaction that you may have had when I gave the Rhystic Study Avatar the Last Airbender example. That's one of those, I mean, yeah, technically kind of feelings. It feels like a stretch just to justify a good card, but I'm not like mad about it or anything. I get that that theme is hard to translate into Magic, and they don't want a deck that's just a pushover, because that would be less fun for everybody at the table. But then compare that to the hypothetical situation where someone's like, yeah, this is my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles deck, and then the way that they win the game with that deck is with one of those classic Torment of Hailfires or Triumph of the Hordes. Those are the moments where I realize the skepticism rises more strongly in me. Those are the moments where my first mental instinct is a little bit of a "really, queen?" kind of deal. To be clear, it's not about the cards themselves. Torment of Hailfire in a Nicol Bolas themed deck, for instance, would actually be a perfect way to cap off that kind of game. The issue with the Turtles example is just because of the disconnect between the story that was told and the way that story ended. Not necessarily an outright lie, but certainly a difference in expectation. Those differences in reaction are important to pay attention to, and at least for me, they're part of my own personal solution to this issue whenever I encounter it in my own brewing. Support pieces that don't fit the theme are one thing, but the way the game ends is another. Win conditions that are off theme feel like a bigger breach, probably because they're the last impression of the game. When you say this is an X theme deck or an oops all Y type of deck, immediately the ending is the thing that we start to speculate on, and we hope that the ending delivers upon the promise of the premise. I think it sounds hecking delightful to get beat up by a bunch of mutated turtles that are using ninja weapons. I'll remember that TMNT deck for years if you can pull it off. Or it sounds like the height of comedy to me if you can kill me with a dozen crabs, as long as you don't take 29 turns to do it. That's why that Voxy deck example is so fun. And those things are hard as heck to do, don't get me wrong. I have mad respect for people who do commit 100% to the theme, even though it means that they don't always get to do much with those decks. And simultaneously, I understand if folks have run out of patience trying to get some of those disparate stars to line up together in those decks with those strict themes. And I get why they might reach for some of those things that will help kickstart that deck into some actual motion, even if, to me, it doesn't feel like the same choice that I would make. Because again, this isn't necessarily easy. I described my theme deck earlier where my theme would absolutely justify me playing a Jeweled Lotus. Heck, even that Nicol Bolas theme deck idea could easily justify playing a bunch of salt-inducing cards like God Pharaoh's Statue and a bunch of Force to Discard. And that's a pretty tough dynamic. I can't say I'd be thrilled about them, but if a person built that deck that way, they would be staying on theme, you know? Or I've been working on a deck that super isn't finished yet, but that's based on some of the Doctor Who time things that we got last year. I want the deck to play with time, to make time my weapon. I'm even going to end up running Aeon Engine, one of EDHREC's preview cards from years and years ago. And while I was building it, I realized, gee, leaning real hard into time as a theme sure would make extra turn spells easy to justify, wouldn't it? But I'm not going to do that, because the reason I want to build that deck is for me and my opponents to have a good time, for them to encounter a novel experience that maybe they don't get to see very often. And I think that extra turns, thematic to the deck or not, would get in the way of that raw enjoyment. And I'll go one step more past that, because extra turns are kind of a big obvious example, but maybe some more granular detail can really help this point hit home. In my various drafts of that deck so far, and again, this deck is super not finished yet, I find that I keep reaching for the card Taunt from the Rampart, because the deck would have the colors to play this one. And I have been aching to cast this spell ever since it was released last year. I love this thing. It's such a cool card. But technically, it wouldn't fit the time theme that I'm going for. It fits the colors, and it's a dang good card. And it's a card that makes me happy. It makes me smile. But it's not going to wind up in my final version. I just can't really justify it with the theme in my head, with the vision that I had for that deck. Because if I want that deck to feel like time was my weapon, then this card, which could totally help me win a game, would perhaps leave a confusing or maybe even false final impression, rather than making it feel like I actually aced the theme, like I delivered on the deck's timey-wimey premise. And it's possible that example feels like a bit of a sidebar, but my point is, avoiding the obvious stuff doesn't mean you don't still fall victim to these kinds of habits. You can fall into it just with cards you like, too. So if you really are trying to commit to a hard restriction, keep an eye out for the ways that your brain tries to rationalize different card choices, because it turns out it can be real tricky. So, for the too long didn't watch crowd, tight restrictions have an ironic relationship with Goodstuff cards. The more strict a theme, sometimes the more compelled that deck might feel to try and justify running EDH powerhouses. Avoiding these pitfalls is a line in the sand that people will have drawn in very different places. If another player has their line drawn in a different place for their deck, I at least hope that the details of this video can shed a little bit of light on how they were influenced to make that decision and why they made it. Even if it's not to your taste, hopefully you at least get where they're coming from. If you've got a theme deck, when you announce it for a game, it's important to acknowledge the extra strings that are attached to that description. It might be the case that what some other people expect from an XYZ theme deck isn't how you interpret that description. So perhaps giving even more a description about that deck will help make sure that people don't feel thrown off by your actual card choices. And if you're stressing about building a deck that has a hard restriction and you're wondering how people might feel about a card that you're trying to justify or rationalize, think about how you would react as the opponent in that situation, and think also about the last impression that a card like that might leave on the game. As we've said a few times on this channel, we like building decks that we'd enjoy losing to. So when you're building those things and considering those cards, ask yourself if you would enjoy losing to them. That's it from me. I've got a silly theme deck to go try and finish now. What's your weirdest off-the-wall meme theme deck, and how did you navigate those odd, weird deck building restrictions? Let me know in the comments. Remember that liking and subscribing fit into any theme deck, and thanks so much for watching. And as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.